By popular request, we're going to add in a little bonus here dealing with radio buttons. So radio buttons are pretty easy on the GUI. You can drag and drop. Like everything else, they're just an element that you can pull in from, excuse me, there's just an element you can pull in from code. So when I pull in the radio button here, you can go to the source code. You can see it's just a special type. So there's our J radio button of type J radio button here. So it's just a normal bit of code we can add in. And from like everything else, we can change the label on this. So here, let's actually add a label for a category. So we'll say, what else do we want to know about people? We'll talk about their, I don't know what you would call it, their preferred hand, let's say. So people can be left-handed or right-handed. All right, so put that out there, and yeah, there you go. And so you could be right-handed. You can be, oops, I didn't hit the enter there. So right-handed, there you go. You can be left-handed. And let's say you can also be ambidextrous. We'll just add in another category right there. Ambidextrous. I think that's spelled right. If not, somebody will let me know, I'm sure. All right, so by its default, it's pretty easy to add in radio buttons, but they're not exactly working yet. If I go off and I run my code for the radio buttons, what's going to happen is we're going to have those radio buttons, and it's going to pop up, and let me swing it back over here. So right, left, ambidextrous, look, they all lit up. The idea of radio buttons is I'm supposed to be one or the other. I can't be all of them at the same time. So in my source code, it's adding them in, but one of the other elements that's required in Java is I have to have what's called a button group. Now the button group is not a display element. I grab it, I drag it over here, and it shows up. And you can see down here I have my button group. It's named button group 1 down here. Class is button group. But it's not something that is a display element. It's for grouping buttons. Got that by the name button group, but grouping them to say which ones of the radio buttons go together. Because I could have several lists. I could throw in gender. I could throw in preference of food or race or something else that could be done through a radio button, but it might not be. I mean, you might prefer checkboxes for something. Gender, race, those things are a bit more fluid these days. So that's where you have to be careful about the type of data you're selecting and what's valid information to be able to put in. So for the button group here, I can come through and rename the button group. So I can call this hand preference preference group inside there. So that'll make my code a little bit easier down later. And then right here, I can actually change the variable names to be right button. I'm going to change this one to be left button, and then I'll change this one to be ambidextrous. Again, we'll see if it's spelled right. All right, so now for each of these buttons, I have to figure out which group it's going to go in. It probably didn't do it by default, but there is a place down here somewhere that tells me which button group it's in. Am I in the right button here? Oops, let's go back to the properties. And so the properties, there you go, button group right here. So you can see hand preference group. That's why I renamed it as opposed to button group 1, which would be the default. That way I know which one it is. It's the hand preference group, just in case you had more than one of them on your display. So there you go. You could have more than one on your display because you could have the preference of region, north, south, east, and west. You could also say, do you prefer to do the email versus phone versus other contact? You could have another button. Not required, but you could have multiple groups on there. And that's where this button group is important. So now that I've got my button group set up, I can run this again, and it'll pop up quicker this time because it's compiled. Now I have left, right, and ambidextrous. And you can see when I clicked one of them, either the text or the button itself works. It switches between those. Just out of reference, I could have these top to bottom. There's nothing to say that they have to be left to right. They can be wherever they want to on the screen. I mean, they could be nowhere near each other on the screen, but you can see they work just the same. It's the button group that groups them together. It has nothing to do with the placement or anything like that inside of the code. So that's the button group coming out. How do I know which one gets clicked? So when I do the submit button here, there's some validation going on. Let's just start simply by which one got clicked on. And so I'm going to do that simply by system.out.println. And so we can talk to the button group. So this was the hand preference group inside of there. And we can see what's inside of there, that this is where you as a learning developer can start to play with things and see where stuff comes in. So you can see get button count. This, we look at this text, the number of buttons in the group. Well, that will tell us there's 3 buttons. That's static information. Get elements, so it's return all the buttons that are in the group. That's kind of cool. Get selection sounds like a good thing. So let's see what this prints out real quick. We'll say get selection inside of there, and we'll just print out what gets selected. So when we run this right here, and we say submit, I must provide a first name, last name, integer, so let's do that. And then we select left here, you can see it's printing out the person, and then down here it's done a JToggle button mode. And it's done null the first time, and then JToggle button mode, because I didn't select anything the first time, and instead I selected something. This might be helpful. It depends what I can do with that. But you notice it says I get JToggle button mode. I have to figure out what the heck that guy means. And so what can I do with that? Control space. I'm hitting the dot and control space. I can see what are the things that are happening. So I can get the action command. I can get the mnemonic. I can get selected objects. I can say isn't it. There's nothing useful here that tells me what the button is. So the first instinct is I can go to the group and I can say get which one selected, but the problem with the button group is more than one could be selected. I don't know what's all going on there. It actually becomes very complicated unless I have a very dynamic group to do it this way. So the recommendation, and you could play with this, you can figure it out, but in order to keep it simple, which is sometimes preferable in code, when I have a discrete list of 3 or 4 or 5 items, or maybe 10 items, but I know we're not adding them. If we're going to add something in, we're not generating it. We're not loading from a database and saying, what are the options? We're not loading from an external source and dynamically setting them up if it's static. Then probably what's easier is I can go through each one of the buttons. So I can say if right button dot is selected right there. And then at that point, and I haven't updated everything in my code, I haven't added to my person class whether you're right-handed or left-handed, but in theory we would have the p.set hand preference. And this, again, it doesn't exist in my code right now. This is not in my person class. I could add that in there. But let's say I could just put something hard-coded. So I might have something like that that's going inside there. I don't have that right now. So what I will do is just simply, I'll just system, so s.out.println right. All right, so that's if right selected. If right wasn't selected, well, perhaps left was selected. Is selected, right? And then I can do the same thing, left. And again, if I add my variable to my object, I would be setting the preference that way. Else, if ambidextrous, nope. My control space got crazy. Ambidextrous dot is selected. And again, I'm using code complete, control space to make code magically appear right here. So always remember that tool. That's a good option out there. Then I can say both here. Else, if none of those were selected, then none of them were selected. Then I can do my error message. So J option pane dot show message dialog this and select a hand preference. All right. So this is how I would go through and pull that data back out in the simplest of ways. So give that a shot. I hit the run button there. Bring the screen back over. So first name, last name, age, add submit, select a hand preference. Okay. I didn't integrate it with the rest of my logic. I still should, but I can go through and click the left hand button, and you can see left was selected down here. All right, so the point of this little bit was to show you the buttons, how to set up the buttons, how to set up the button group, and then a quick and easy way to check the validation of the buttons, and more importantly, to assign values of the buttons. It is plausible to search through the group, get stuff out. It's just also very complex, and you're diving into the API to figure out what the right call is, to figure out the button type, and then cast it appropriately. And again, more complicated than we need to do at this phase of your learning. So it's okay just to do this straightforward, but you'll find examples of doing it other ways online if you search for it. Again, to integrate this the rest of the way, I would go back to my person object. I would add in another attribute for the hand preference. This is all the stuff that you probably have done for your object already. And then I would integrate this logic where not only am I giving this here, I should also do, I'll just add this because it's easy, all data received is equal to false. So that way, oops. So that way you can see I've not received all my data at that point. All right, so this is your button group logic. And so hopefully if you want to use radio buttons, you have some backup, some information to help you use those going forward.